Throughout the history of the world, people have thought of the most amazing stories. Many of these stories were spoken orally for thousands of years, and some of these stories are even lost to us today. But as time and technology moved forward and advanced, people were able to write down their stories for others to read. These became literature, and many pieces of literature have lasted through trial after trial to entertain people worldwide today as they had back when they were written. Britain, while considered a more isolated place for stories to flourish, is not an exception. From Shakespeare to J.K. Rowling, the British people have been able to delight the world with their stories for hundreds of years. But behind the story, there is always another, hidden and alluded to, and that would be the now of the time. Whatever was occurring during the time of the piece being written, whatever the culture was at the time. However, culture changes as the people and ideas around it change or evolve. Which led me to wonder this: how has British literature evolved over time as British culture has changed? First, I needed to figure out what literature precisely entailed and what British literature truly was. I found the definition of literature to be anything that was written down, and had two specific types: written, which passed from the author's mind onto paper, and oral, which was passed down orally through generations, and eventually written down when technology evolved to allow them to do so, with many subgenres within each type. I decided to focus more on the written type, as those pieces would be more unchanged from their original and be more focused on the culture or the area of time that it was written, which is different from the oral type, which may have started being told centuries before being written. I then looked at the definition of British literature and found it to be anything from the British Isles, which happened to include the Emerald Isle itself, Ireland. Since it was clear that we were supposed to think of Britain and Ireland as two separate entities, and definitely cover them separately, I came up with this working definition of British literature that will be used in this project. A work that started on paper, that was written by a British person, or took place in England, Wales, Scotland, or Northern Ireland. I then picked out pieces of literature that I thought were the most impactful. I then realized that I had picked out a list of about 50 pieces, and, seeing how that was unrealistic for me to read while having a substantial amount of time to research more into the question, decided to maybe narrow in a bit. I first picked out the pieces that I thought were the most important, then I looked at their setting, time period, and closer where their author was born, and was able to narrow it down to these 5. The Phoenix and the Turtle by William Shakespeare, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson, The Picture of Dorian Gray by Oscar Wilde, 1984 by George Orwell, and the Harry Potter series by J.K. Rowling. After reading the literature, I began to look into British events and the parallels it had toward the literature read. I was able to find a parallel for The Phoenix and the Turtle easily with what was happening immediately prior: an uprising against Queen Elizabeth by Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex and favourite of the Queen. In the poem, 2 birds, a phoenix and a turtle dove, are truly in love and soulmates, but end up dying at the end of the piece. This compares to the relationship between the Queen and the Earl, with him falling in and out of her favour until he was finally executed in 1601, the same year that this poem came out. Coincidence? I think not. I began to look at the other pieces to compare them to real-life events, but this was the only one that had a specific event attached. So now began the real interesting part, looking into British culture and then comparing and contrasting to find out the connections. How did Britain go from writing stories about values, morals, and love, to dystopian futures and magic schools? The oldest piece of literature read was The Phoenix and the Turtle, next followed by The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with a picture of Dorian Gray accompanying it within 2 years. However, there is still a good 187-year gap between The Phoenix and the Turtle and The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and the genres and themes have changed significantly in that time. In this near 200-year gap, Britain went from combining souls in forever love to splitting them to show the good and evil of mankind. How had this occurred? What had happened during the reigns of these queens to make their literature become so different from each other? During the reign of Queen Elizabeth, the population boomed, prices rose, and England entered the European Renaissance. Religion was on the forefront of everyone's minds with the reforms of the Queen's father, King Henry VIII. Religion was especially an important role in The Phoenix and the Turtle, with allusions being made to the Christian virtue of chastity. This was also an allusion to the parallel previously mentioned with Queen Elizabeth, as she was seen as the Virgin Queen. Whether this is actually accurate or not is up for you to decide. The literature of this time was also mostly poetry, as it was one of the 5 humanities supported by the Renaissance, and it was seen as showing virtue. However, by the 1640s, when civil war broke out resulting in the rule of super Puritan don't you dare have any fun because you need to be praying, Oliver Cromwell, poetry had fallen out of style to be replaced with novels. By the time of Queen Victoria, poetry, while having good quality, was much less read compared to novels. During Victorian times, up to 7,000 novelists came about to publish around 60,000 different books. Among these novelists were Robert Louis Stevenson and Oscar Wilde, with their novels The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde and The Picture of Dorian Gray. Both of these books are identified as Gothic, which was a genre of literature similar to the horror genre today, with books of that genre containing elements of fear, horror, death, and gloom. However, still containing some romantic elements of the movement before it, with nature, individuality, and high emotion. Both of these books were also set on a London backdrop, and show the moral struggles that were plaguing the London people during this time. The 1800s was full of European imperial conquests and rapid industrialization. However, by the end of the century, when both of these novels were written, people were thinking that England was becoming less civilized. In The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, this is shown by Dr. Jekyll splitting himself to become a completely different man, Mr. Hyde. While Jekyll was a kindly old doctor, Hyde was a vicious young man who literally walked over a little girl and killed her. The story showed that good-intentioned, civilized people were always amongst the more vicious people, and that this struggle being shown in society also occurred within the people themselves. The Picture of Dorian Gray also shows this, by having a young man named Dorian Gray realize that he would one day grow old, and wish that he could stay young forever, like the painting his friend Basil had recently made for him. This then actually occurred, making it so Dorian would physically stay young forever, while his painting grew old and ugly. Dorian began to do horrible things. He first fell for a young actress named Sybil Vane, then promptly fell out of love with her, said nasty things to her face which drove her to suicide, and then basically got away with it. He continued to do more horrible things while staying young for almost 18 years, while his portrait grew more and more ugly as he continued to grow more and more inhumane and kept doing moral injustices. Dorian was finally driven completely insane at the end, and stabbed his portrait, causing him to become the man in the portrait and then to die. Showing that Dorian could appear so innocent while being such a horrid person is similar to The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, with the portrait being Dr. Jekyll and the real Dorian to be Mr. Hyde. By portraying the fears of the Victorian people of the time in subtle ways, these books were able to relate to the British people while still entertaining them. This theme would continue onwards into the 1940s with the publication of 1984. This book showed the British government as totalitarian and under the rule of the ever-present Big Brother and the ruling party. The novel, written off of the fears and disgust that Orwell had about authoritarianism, showed the main character Winston Smith as a government worker editing the newspapers and living in fear of everything, as even thinking thoughts against the ruling party and Big Brother was a crime. He ends up breaking the law, as it is easy to do so, and frankly he gets tricked into it, gets arrested, and brainwashed into exactly what the party wants. 1984 was written during the rise of the Soviet Union, when many of the British, along with other democratic nations, were fearful of the spread of communism and thereby of the Communist Party. While not as subtle as the Victorian novels when addressing the fears of the British people, it was still similar and got its point across. However, this theme was completely thrown out of the window in the 1990s and 2000s. The 1990s was a decade of looking back, which makes sense when looking at literature of the time, considering that the main export from the British Isles was about history. However, one book series took the world by storm: Harry Potter. This series was able to affect the world, as many people during this time were abandoning books to look at the internet and play video games. The Harry Potter series brought people back to reading, and was even a significant factor on getting the millennial generation to be the most reading generation of their predecessors. This also really affected the British Isles, causing children, like children around the world were, to read again. History, while an interesting topic, wasn't exactly what every 10-year-old wanted to read on their Sunday afternoons. Books about a magic school that they could maybe attend, if not in real life, then in their imaginations, were a definite must-read to them. The Harry Potter series was able to interest people and be different from the norm of the time in Britain, which made them all the more special and exciting. The books themselves became a part of British culture, becoming one of the most beloved series of the century. So while literature has been written and spoken for century upon century and has had a profound effect on culture worldwide, literature itself is based on the culture it represents and changes its themes along with it. While I don't know how books written by Indians or Americans or Australians are similar to those written in Britain, or how the Bronte sisters were able to shape the Gothic literature genre so much, or the impact of literature written by a British person that took place outside of their country, or even how oral literature changed over time with culture, and I would like to know these if I just had the time. I do know this: literature today will be nothing like literature in the past and in the future, and I can't wait to see what twist those British Isles have to throw at me in the climax.